Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Monday, July 3rd, 2023. Time for another month. Happy July, everybody. It was almost July when we last spoke to you on Friday. Everybody knew it was going to be July the next day, but it didn't matter because it was Saturday and we weren't on the air. Saturday, Sunday, now July 3rd. Tomorrow, July 4th, which, you know, who cares if you're listening in Canada, right? So, not such a big deal after all. But a little odd because we'll have a holiday right in the middle of the week, which is kind of a weird place to have it, and it's a Tuesday, and not a lot of places, you know, sometimes if the holiday is Christmas, right, they'll say like, all right, well, that's not actually supposed to be a holiday with separation of church and state, but we love it anyway, so what the hell, and then since you're going to be off on Tuesday, might as well take off on Monday as well. Mostly, I think, not the case here with July 4th, which is fine, but if you're lucky enough to make a 4-day weekend out of it, fantastic. But today we're all back pretending that we're going to be, you know, just having a regular week, even though everybody knows they're going to be off tomorrow. So I suspect there's going to be a lot of clock watching today and solitaire playing, if that's the way people still waste their time while they're waiting. It used to be Minecraft way back in, not Minecraft, but the Minesweeper way back in the day. The kids do the Minecraft. The kids today, they do the Minecraft, and they waste the time that way. All right. So lots to round up, of course, from this weekend. John Shiflett, who already knows we're on the air, sharing that fact with you. What's he got in terms of historical dates for today? Well, historically, it has been July 3rd every time this day comes around. But other things that have happened on this day. Well, true, right? Good. 160 years ago today. That's a round number, because the number at the end of it is round. The one in the middle is kind of round a little bit too. Not so much the one in 160. 160 years ago today, the pivotal 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. If you don't remember any battles from the Civil War, if you don't remember any, then I can't help you. This won't be the one you remember either. But if you remember one and then no other ones, that's probably the one you know. One of the big famous ones. Battle of Gettysburg ended with a decisive Union victory as the Union Army of the Potomac defeated the invading Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Remember, this is all about states' rights, except it really wasn't. It was about sex trafficking. States' rights, and just keep your grubby paws off of our states and let us have self-determination, unless we invade you. And by the way, I read some very interesting things a couple of years ago, probably not on the anniversary, but maybe that was what prompted it, about general orders issued to Confederates and Confederate troops during the invasion of Pennsylvania, at which time, allegedly, they were permitted by General Lee, the fine, upstanding, noble General Lee, told them, yeah, you know what, any free black people, I was going to say black men, but that's because they referred to it that way, but that's not right. Anybody, it wouldn't have mattered based on gender, but they told them, while you're up here, as a bonus, you can snatch any black people you find and either return them to slavery if you believe they're escaped slaves, or sell them into slavery in the South if you want to. That's just part of the booty of war. Go ahead and do that. What a fine, upstanding citizen he was. Anyway, you should absolutely feel free to drop any myths you might have had about the idea of Lee being a noble guy. You know what? I think there's still, from like 3 or 4 years ago, an article in Pocket that I never got back around to. I think Adam Serwer might even have written about it, but the myth of General Lee and his nobility and honor and everything. It was very interesting, and it had this episode in it, if I'm not mistaken. So there you go. That's the long-term historical look back. There's also more, by the way, as he adds here. Read the Washington, D.C. Evening Star Monday, July 6th, 1863, proclaiming the victory here. Great and glorious news, or glate, that they might have used that word back then. The Union arms victorious in the greatest battle of the century, and that's why you remember it. It was the greatest one of the century. Look at this. The Union County Star in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, home of Bucknell University. Chronicle for July 7th. It was late getting the news back then. Union victory, the Gettysburg battles, the greatest contests of the times. That's a lot. Plus, on top of it all, some 100 years after that, then, well, a little bit more than that, but on the same date, the guy you know as the Mighty OCD on social media was born. So how do you like that? Happy birthday. Excellent. That's a fun way of bringing it around to telling us it's your birthday. Hope you enjoy it, and we will fill your day with, as it turns out, the hottest news of the weekend, 350,000 articles waiting in Pocket and in Greg's Rafto stories, all about the fact that it turns out that the plaintiff in the 303 Creative case, the Supreme Court case handed down just at the end of last week, doing what everybody expected, once again affirming the right of some, the so-called right of some service provider or another, in this case, allegedly, this is only allegedly the case too, a website designer, who was refusing to make a wedding site for a gay couple. Except, as it turns out, over the weekend, and as it turns out even before the weekend, because people knew this and it didn't come out. This is reminding me, anyway, it turns out this place may never have been a real business. They may never have actually had any clients. They may never have been contacted by any same-sex couples whatsoever asking for a website. And the name of one of the people allegedly a part of this same-sex couple says a couple of things. One, I'm married already. Two, and so not looking for a wedding site. Two, I'm also not involved in a same-sex relationship. So that kind of is out of it too. That's not right. Three, I'm a web designer myself. There's no reason in the world why I would have gone to another web design company asking them to design me a website for a wedding I wasn't having to a partner I wasn't engaged to. So it doesn't really make a great deal of sense, and that's sort of outrageous. And as it turns out, the more people are looking at it, well, for one thing, the more people look at it, the more articles get written about it. I've seen so many, and I'm not certain that they all make different points. I'm going to have a hard time selecting which ones to deal with. But it's crazy enough that it's risen to the level of, I've been just saying on social media, as it turns out, 303 Creative is like the George Santos of SCOTUS plaintiffs. There's just nothing about the case that appears to just be factually true. So we're in a bit of a state here in the United States of America. You don't have to tell who you actually are or what actually happened to you in order for you to have a court case. And by the way, I mean, basic constitutional law, this person can't have standing to have a case, to bring a case, if there was no injury. In fact, if the person who supposedly asked for a website didn't ask for a website, and you don't actually have a business designing websites, you can't establish that you have an injury here. You're not supposed to be in court. You should be on trial for perjury right now, not on the right-wing lunatic talk circuit as a culture warrior hero. But whatever, this is one of those sort of YOLO, LOL YOLO, nothing matters moments where we have to reassure ourselves that something must matter somewhere. But you don't have to, tell a real story in order to get to court. You don't have to have a real biography in order to run for Congress. You don't have to have real votes or real electors in order to run for president. Nothing matters anymore. I guess if you get in front of the right gavels, people who are willing to ignore this stuff, I guess you can get away with almost anything. So I don't know. We'll see whether the news is just beginning to spread. So we kind of have to wait and see what happens to this plaintiff, and whether there's any pushback. No, all of those claims about nothing being true are themselves not true. And then we have to figure out whether any of that is just more lies and gaslighting or not. But it seems to me you should be able to get to the bottom of, are you this person and did this happen? Well, probably a little earlier in the process than at the Supreme Court, or worse, post decision at the Supreme Court. All right, Greg Dworkin allegedly is here. As it turns out, I mean, I've never actually asked you for your ID when you call in the morning, but maybe I need to start.
Well, I was here, or I had the potential to be here, which is what really matters.
Right. Okay. So honestly, right, this show is 24 hours. Potentially, by the way. So all of you were waiting for 9 a.m.
You
I don't
can
know
play
what
it
you're
back
doing.
at any hour, so that's absolutely true.
That's true. And you could just imagine that we're on, and, it's as good as anything. It'll get me standing at the Supreme Court anyway. So imagine.
Well, here's the thing. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so a lot of this is sort of, well, duh, even though it's not dealing with the fine points of the law. What I mean by that is that it's pretty clear to non-lawyers that the Supreme Court decides whatever they want to decide based on how they feel about the outcome.
Yes.
And then they go back and they figure out, how it is that they could get there. Yeah. Everybody knows
Armando
that.
Always told us
and
that.
Lawyers will argue, no, it's textual. It's based on no, that's bullshit.
Yeah, as it turns out, now that's the case.
Right? So everybody knows that, so this is no surprise. Whether or not you have standing is up to them to decide, not based on logic.
Yes.
And actually, if you go back, I think, to Roe v. Wade, that was a case that was decided after the lady was already pregnant.
Well, yeah, it was.
And later on in the course of things.
Well, yeah.
But it was based on what could have happened.
Yes. Right.
And if that's
I
the
think
case, looking at 303 based on what could have happened, okay, well, what's the difference?
Well, I mean, one person actually had this fact pattern happen to them.
Yeah, but the point is based on what could, but it was after the fact that they decided the case. I'm just saying you can make all sorts of arguments about why this was or wasn't correctly decided. The point is they came up with what they wanted and then they rationalized it.
Well,
afterwards.
It's certainly the case. I mean, Armando has told us enough times that is how they end up deciding cases. They decide what they want to do and then they kind of backfill logic in there. I've seen the Roe example raised, and I mean, one of the things you kind of have to remember is pregnancy doesn't last forever, but court cases kind of do. And if you
businesses don't last forever.
No, but if you show up pregnant and you want access to an abortion and you sue for it, let's say.
Well, there's a time window there.
Yes, right. And if the court case takes 2 years to get to the Supreme Court, when you get to the Supreme Court, they're not going to be pregnant anymore, one way or the other.
If you're working on a wedding, there's a time window there too.
I'm
just saying there's all sorts of different ways you can rationalize why this is that, and what about this
that
other
one
thing
is
over here.
particularly not
it's all annoying.
good.
The fact is they just decide what they want to do, and then they come up with a reason.
Yes. Well, since that's the underlying point, we'll stick with that.
Yeah, well, it's true. And then
that's why we're sticking with it.
The other thing that is interesting is whether it's affirmative action,
it is,
which not everybody's thrilled about anyway.
Right.
And certainly Asian Americans felt like they were being discriminated against. So they're sort of happy about the ruling.
Yeah, right. There's a bit of a split there, but yeah, they're ignoring the part of the community that says, no, this was a good thing.
And whether or not 303 decision, which was the one about the website and LGBTQ plus patrons,
yes,
is in fact a free speech issue, not an action issue, which is the argument at the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. One can also argue that, well, look, what the Supreme Court said is that you can't be forced into doing stuff, and that has relevance for when Ron DeSantis in Florida forces you to do stuff.
Right.
So there's all sorts of implications that are actually not that bad if you take it to its logical conclusion. So you have all these arguments swirling around. And again, the non-lawyers say, well, I get the argument, I get the sophistry. Fact of the matter is, whether it's Florida or at the Supreme Court in Washington, the judges will still decide what they want to decide based on what they want to decide. So making an argument about why it's not that bad is kind of dumb, because maybe it's not logically, but that's not how it's going to be applied.
Right. Well, that's one of the issues. And what's leaving everybody confused, I talked about it a bit over the weekend on social media, right? What's leaving everyone confused is we all were taught, well, what the law is and the way it works is you set out a standard, you apply it equally, you extrapolate from it logically, and you base it all on what have we done in the past. And as it turns out, if that stuff gets in the way of the outcome that they want, it doesn't really mean that much. And that's got everybody confused. And a lot of lawyers, too. So, don't think it's just because you're not a lawyer that you're confused about things. The lawyers are scratching their heads because they went to school and they said, this is how the law works. And they are finding out that is not how the law works. What am I supposed to do?
That really is how it works. So I'm not a lawyer. What does this stare decisis mean? Well, don't worry about it. Doesn't mean anything.
Who cares? Right. I didn't go to law school. Well, you know what?
You didn't need to. Because
you didn't go to law school? That person isn't a web designer. That guy's not trying to get married. What's the difference? Go ahead.
Stare decisis means you're supposed to act based on precedent. Well, no, not if the Supreme Court says otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I acted based on precedent.
They're really
I said the precedent was terrible.
Lately.
Yeah, this is a lot. This is a lot to digest, and there's no real clear way how to do it other than the only conclusion you can come away with is, it really doesn't make a difference to them, any of this
now,
stuff.
Throw student debt onto it, but let's...
yes, okay.
Let's also, make it clear that it's not the end of the world.
Well, I'm here. Yeah,
for
that's true.
The 303 case, yet to be decided about what all that really means. It's just too unclear. On affirmative action, if you get to the same place doing it a new way, that's great. Because people did have questions about the old affirmative action ways of doing things. On the other hand, that has huge implications for diversity and inclusion. And, the bottom line is going to be, all right, Harvard and University of North Carolina were so directed by the Supreme Court. What does that mean for them? University of North Carolina says nothing. We're still going to do things the same way. And Harvard says we're just going to do it the same thing, only differently. So the bottom line is going to be, all right, in 2 years, what's your black enrollment?
Yeah.
And how does it compare to now? And that's really what matters.
Yeah. Well, lots of people looking for different ways to get to the same result. So, good, I guess. And it makes sense that they would be looking to do that and that they would try, even in the face of this ruling, because the ruling itself makes little to no sense in terms of traditional, what the conservatives who wrote the opinion feel are the conservative bounds of government supervision and action. The small government folks who want to tell
small government's out. That's so 1970s.
Yeah. Exactly. So, it'll be real interesting to see how they work around it. It's big government making you do what
we want is what's going on here.
I did see somewhere over the weekend somebody saying that Stephen Miller, and I don't know why he decided to inject himself into this except to say, here's a chance to be a big Nazi. He apparently spent the weekend sending threatening letters to 200 law schools around the country. I don't know why exactly law schools more than anything else, but saying, don't try to circumvent this ruling. If you try to come up with another way of getting to the same result, we'll sue you. We'll take you to court. Which I don't know why he focused on law schools, but then I thought
he's focusing on law schools because he really, really, really doesn't like Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's doing a marvelous job with the Supreme Court.
So, maybe, but you should be probably could be focusing on everyone. And then secondly, just sort of
she's getting Clarence Thomas all upset. He keeps writing stuff that's basically directed at her. It's amazing.
So what are you going to do? Close all the law schools? Stop disagreeing legally. No more law. I don't know. I'm not certain what he was trying to do.
He just wants all the law schools to be white.
I guess so. But I just thought as terms of strategy, like don't threaten law schools with being hauled into court. Where will they get lawyers?
We're going to sue you. That probably scares you. You don't even know what it means to be sued, do you?
Right. The representation's going to be free and the opportunity for professors at 200 law schools to argue before the Supreme Court and file briefs. What a crazy thing. How are we going to get anybody interested in dealing with this case?
So Jonathan Weiler, who is a professor, writes on the affirmative action ruling over at Substack. Below are some notes about the Supreme Court's affirmative action, AA ruling. These will include some arguments from the liberal side that have, for various reasons, essentially said good riddance in college admissions. That is, to put it mildly, a thorny and contested topic. But one thing I want to focus on is what I've seen as a misleadingly simplified account of what it does, who it affects, and therefore the consequences of its elimination. Here's only one example.
Right.
But since Matt Iglesias is very popular and lots of people have cited his 19 theses on affirmative action, I'll refer to his observations as proxy. Let's start with what will certainly be one effect of the ruling. Fewer black students will be admitted to and attend many of the affected schools. Whether over time admission offices find different means than explicit consideration of race to construct the kinds of diversity they want, in the short term there'll be fewer black students at places like UNC. And that's really not debatable. When the University of California system was compelled to stop using affirmative action in the late 90s, the impact was clear. In 1997, the last incoming class for which Cal Berkeley's admissions office used it, 7.5% of the incoming class was African American. In 1998, it was half that, and it's remained so ever since. Michigan had a similar experience after a 2006 ban. The same will almost certainly be true at UNC. So in the above comment, I used the word diversity. What does that mean? J. Caspian Kang, in a thoughtful essay on the impending end of AA last fall, noted that when it first became policy, AA's drafters thought in literally black and white terms. But the U.S. has become vastly more racially and ethnically complex. And in some ways, affirmative action has struggled to keep up. Perhaps the clearest consequences of that bears on the impact that AA has on the admission of some Asian students. To be clear, Asians represent a very large proportion of the student body of virtually all schools that are deemed highly selective, but the heart of the lawsuit, as the court just decided specifically in the Harvard part of the case, is that Asian Americans were discriminated against in admissions. Iglesias included a comment from an Asian American that rightly argued Asian Americans were not responsible for enslavement of black people, nor the larger legacy and realities of racism that stand as a core justification for affirmative action, and therefore it's fundamentally unfair that Asian Americans should have to bear the burden of affirmative action efforts to redress historical injustice. Now, whether that's the empirical effect is another question. Ellie Mistel argues that in California, which ended its affirmative action policies over 25 years ago, the studies show that without affirmative action, black enrollment plummets, Latino enrollment plummets, AAPI enrollment goes up a little, and whites flood the system. This is at least one data point that suggests the focus on Asian Americans as the key losers is overstated.
Okay.
So that's an interesting point.
Yes.
Regardless, if as a result of this ruling the percentage of Asian students increases at UNC while the percentage of black students decreases, is that student body less diverse, more diverse, or just differently diverse? Those are the kinds of questions reasonable people are raising, and those questions speak to some of the larger confusion the diversity talk has engendered and that has made defending affirmative action on the basis of diversity, especially to people who are already skeptical, difficult and ineffective. And that's part of the reason why it's, such a fraught discussion. It's not that there are clear lines here. There aren't.
Okay. Yes.
So when the Supreme Court said you can't do it this way, which is what they said, the idea that maybe you could do it some other way, maybe the other way might even be more fair or at least easier to explain, that remains to be seen. Maybe.
Yeah. Entirely possible. So, yeah, they'll have to be getting creative. And I suggest that they ought not to worry very much about being sued by Stephen Miller.
Right. And the other point that many people have brought up is, on the other hand, it's good to focus on UNC because don't focus on Harvard.
It's always welcome.
Right. What Harvard does or doesn't do may have nothing to do with like everybody else in the world. They certainly think so.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yes, I prefer to have the focus be other schools, certainly. Whether it's UNC, okay, fine. Right.
The other thing that's interesting is that this is immediately brought up and with some support on the conservative side. The idea that, well, fine, but what about legacy admissions?
Yes.
Maybe they should be done away with. Like, what's their point? Because they're white people, rich white people.
Right.
And you don't even have to have gone to the school. Basically, if you cut a check, you get in.
Yeah, that's true, too.
Kushner, Trump, and other people like that have doors open to them simply because they have money.
Yes. Well, that's what, that's what operates universities, as it turns out.
Well, we need the money to run. Well, do it differently.
Yeah. Right. Well,
maybe the Supreme Court needs to tell you to do it differently, but do it differently.
I had wondered.
That also remains on the table in terms of whether that's coming up for suit.
That's true. Somebody will likely bring some, construct a suit. It doesn't matter who it is or whether anything actually happened to you either. You just, if you feel like you've got a hypothetical argument, start a cake company and go for it.
Right. And just to mention in passing, so they also decided that Biden can't do the student loan thing the way he wanted to.
Right.
And again, that was fairly arbitrary, but not unexpected. In fact, it was so unexpected, Biden had a plan B to announce, ready to go. Yeah. Like moments after the Supreme Court announced the decision, Kyle Griffin tweets, Reuters says Biden will announce new actions to protect student loan borrowers. Mm-hmm. There is a plan B. It's going to take a while, and it's not going to be immediate, and people are going to be impacted by probably having to pay back their loans while this is working. But interestingly, Politico Playbook looked at the politics of this and says, as to the politics, advocates for student borrowers have pointed out that their ire is squarely at the court, not Biden. Those we spoke to last night were actually pleasantly surprised that a plan B was already in the works, a stark contrast to the criticism the White House invited last year for not immediately laying out next steps after the court knocked down Roe v. Wade, which everybody in the world saw coming. So they were flat-footed on that one. As of today, Biden is standing in the corner of student loan borrowers and standing against the court that wants to take away their rights to debt relief, said Mike Pierce, the executive director of the Student Borrower Protection Center. But at the end of the day, we're going to measure this by who's debt-free, and the jury's still out on whether the president is ultimately going to be able to keep the promise. I hate framing it as, well, Biden didn't keep his promise. Well, he certainly tried. The Supreme Court said you can't. That's not the same thing as I changed my mind or I didn't act.
Right. Yeah, no, well, that would be an incorrect framing, but it would be the one that Republicans will be concerned trolling. Right, certainly.
Yeah, but, so far, that's not necessarily going to work, I don't think.
No, but, neither does the Supreme Court's logic. So we'll see which one collapses first. All right, we'll be right back unless
Ketanji Brown Jackson when we come back.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I've been reading over the break already some new additions to the Rafto stories that Greg promised us, and I'm reading while we're doing it.
So
now your turn to read them, I guess.
This was an NBC piece back 4 days ago when the decision came down.
Yeah.
Clarence Thomas read his concurring opinion from the bench, announcing that Rudder v. Bollinger, the 2003 ruling that said race could be considered, for all intents and purposes, is overruled. These policies fly in the face of our colorblind Constitution. Two discriminatory wrongs can't make a right. He called the way UNC and Harvard were operating cancerous to young minds. During Thomas's lengthy concurrence, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman to serve on the court, didn't look toward or make eye contact once with Thomas. The second black man to serve on the court, she sat in her seat at the end of the bench, looking straight ahead, taking occasional sips of her coffee, and appeared to be visibly angry.
Well,
that's what the description of those who were there said. So then, after Thomas read his dissent, she added a footnote.
Okay.
Or read his concurrence. She added a footnote to her dissent. And she specifically called out Thomas, which got very personal, which is very interesting because you don't usually see this.
Not since Scalia died.
She says he responds to a dissent I didn't write, demonstrates an obsession with race consciousness that far outstrips my or UNC's. She didn't rule in the Harvard one because she recused herself. Right. Ignites too many more straw men to list or fully extinguish here. The takeaway is that those who demand that no one think about race, a classic pink elephant paradox, refuse to see, much less solve for, the elephant in the room, which is race-linked disparities that continue to impede achievement of our great nation. Its full potential. Of course, it's a wonderful dissent, but the point is she added a footnote after the fact because she was ticked off at Thomas for specifically calling her out.
Yeah.
Now, why would he call her out? She's obviously getting under his skin.
Yeah. Well, good.
So I say good. I agree. And I hope that there'll be, she's around to dispute whatever happens for years to come. But as Armando and others have said, I don't need to read dissents. Dissents are when you lose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're only interesting when later courts use it to win.
Yes.
But for now, put it aside. Don't throw it out. Save it. But don't get too...
Yes, I mean, they are used to be, anyway, breadcrumbs, particularly when you did see something like a conservative loss. They would seed their dissent with arguments that they intended to use later because they knew that the plan was always to try and pack the court with conservatives so they could undo everything that had been done every time they lost. So
I remember vaguely... This is kind of fuzzy because it was a long time ago. I was about 14 years old, and I was watching the Chicago convention with my parents. My parents are fairly political and liberal. And we were watching Richard Daley stamp out various and sundry proposals, including one on the Vietnam War. When the proposal failed, the people who brought it up brought out a long black crepe, signal that, they dissented and this was terrible. It was kind of a thing you wear when you're mourning.
I see.
And I looked at it and I said to my father, wow, that's amazing because it's great theater.
Mm-hmm.
And he shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah, but they lost.
Yeah, well.
and that's really the bottom line when it comes to stuff like that. So, dissents are fine, and I'm sure they're very well written, but when you lose, you lose.
Yes. I mean, that's the bottom line of it. Sometimes you can resurrect that line of thinking later on, but, you don't, A, you don't have to, B, you may never get the chance to anyway, and C, circumstances may change between then and now, so, yeah, it's a good opportunity to lay out your disappointment with what's going on, but that's all it is.
Well, as our friend Meteor Blades always says, don't mourn, organize. Mm-hmm. And one of the effects of this is the same as what happened with Dobbs. And Democrats and non-Democrats alike got very upset, voted in referenda like in Kansas, and voted in elections like 2022. And Paul Waldman writes, Biden has a new opportunity in the places Democrats struggle most. And he's talking about the rural areas. It's not an uncommon story these days. The administration is spending a huge amount of federal funding around the country, and politicians love to claim credit. Tommy Tuberville's claiming credit, for example.
Sure.
Nancy Mace and other people who voted against it.
Yeah.
But it's clear that Biden's determined to convince voters in places Democrats have struggled in the past few elections, including rural areas, that his party can improve their lives. It's something Democrats often talk about, but Biden's actually doing something about it. The context here is the administration is distributing a truly massive amount of domestic spending from four significant pieces of legislation: the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science, and Inflation Reduction. Put together, these four bills represent well over $3 trillion in new spending over a decade. And when I've talked with people in rural America about their elected representatives, I've encountered plenty of skepticism about promises of economic development. Yeah, we've heard that before. Politicians don't win points telling a 50-year-old former coal miner he can learn to code. Mm-hmm. Many a Democratic candidate has struggled against that skepticism. But it's one thing to say you support programs, and it's another thing if you can actually show people something tangible they've already provided. And that's the story now.
Okay. See whether it's any more persuasive.
Even if they don't make the immediate connection, the practical effects of the kind of infrastructure and economic development Biden is pushing could make it easier for Democrats to compete in rural America over the longer term. And every genuine improvement in the lives of rural Americans makes it harder to argue against Democrats, he goes on to say. And Jennifer Rubin has a similar column, Bidenomics is transformative. Biden needs to ensure voters know it. So on the one hand, he's putting in the positive stuff. And on the other hand, the negative stuff, like the Supreme Court taking over the United States, it's going to mobilize voters. I mean, that's just how it's going to work. And so the Democrats also have an opportunity, not just to run against Trump, not just to run against Republicans, which has, at best a 54-46 chance of winning with a 54-46 result. They now have an opportunity to run against the Supreme Court. And that may add a couple of points. And the difference between a 54-46 and a 58-42 is enormous.
Yes.
One's a win, the other's a landslide.
Right. Well, we've had the opportunity to run against or on the Supreme Court before, but
we didn't. We blew it. 2016. Shame.
Either sometimes, sometimes even when we did do it, people just didn't respond to it.
Shame on voters.
They need to see.
Now you have a real opportunity to say, okay, remember when we told you in 2016? Look what they did. We were right this time. Get your butt to the polls.
Yeah, well, hopefully, so far it's working. Sometimes you actually need the actual disaster to happen. It's not enough to warn of potential disaster.
Right.
That works better for some things than others, but, not everything is reversible, even by changing the Supreme Court. But at least in that instance, yes, it can motivate people to get to the polls. I have my doubts. They're absolutely right about the amount of money being spent on projects and infrastructure and new spending in rural America. To the extent that rural Americans, like any Americans, make their decisions based on logic, which the Supreme Court just said you don't have to do anymore. Great. But the other thing is, I know you're skeptical about job training, but we've actually put these programs into place already. And they say, but what about the Pizzagate thing? And then what do you do? So I don't know.
But again, all you got to do is win a couple of points. You're not trying to win the majority there.
Or not. You don't even have to win all of them. You don't even have to win the majority.
Just win a couple of points, and that makes all the difference for the GOP between winning and losing.
There's no doubt but that this is the right thing to do, the right way to approach governance and elections. You have to do the things. So
you got to do politics to get policy. Yeah. So the way they know it is in places like North Carolina. Here's just an intriguing piece from the New York Times because it gets under the hood about what's going on. As 2024 voting battles heat up, North Carolina GOP presses forward. Republicans, whose edge in the state has narrowed in recent years, have gone on offense politically, leading to clashes over voting access and control over elections. When you gain a supermajority and you get the Supreme Court, and North Carolina is the place where the Democrats switched from Democrat to Republican, giving them the supermajority, all of a sudden you can do stuff. And so they're trying to do stuff. So if they have a supermajority or an edge, but they feel like their power is eroding, after all, there is a Democratic governor, then you have to put in more voting laws, claim it's to protect against fraud, but in reality, it's the exact opposite of affirmative action.
Yes, that's true too. That's a good point. And notice that's how do Republicans go on offense when they control government? Do they govern in ways that we might not agree are good ideas, but do they govern in ways that show people what they want to do with control of government and the policies that they want to implement? No. They simply make it harder for people to.
That's the policy, but the politics of it is that they're threatened. They feel threatened. They know they're losing.
Yes. Right. Well,
otherwise they wouldn't be doing this.
A story all by itself, and that was the point of it. It is just interesting that they go on offense by burning everything down,
right?
So that no one is allowed to vote them out, even though they're not doing anything.
So far this year, says the story, at least 11 states have passed 13 laws adding such restrictions, according to the Brennan Center. That's a slightly slower clip than 2021, when Republican-led legislators passed a flurry of voting laws, often in response to election lies spread by Trump. North Carolina has a particularly tortured past on voting rights. Under the Voting Rights Act, parts of the state were forced to obtain federal clearance to change voting laws. More recently, in 2016, a federal court struck down a Republican-led voter ID law, saying it had targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision.
Right, because they left notes that said, we're targeting people. Try to get surgical.
Right. Republicans have defended the latest measures. Democrats, however, denounced the voting proposals, with one state senator, Natasha Marcus, going so far as to call them a jumbo jet of voter suppression. During final debate on the bill, she said it includes a lot of problematic things that are going to dissuade people from voting, throw out ballots, and suppress the votes of certain people in a way I think is discriminatory and anti-democratic. So this is all part of the backlash because a black guy got elected to be president. And we've been seeing it ever since. And we just have to ride it out and withstand it and then counteract it when and where we can. Yeah. And so if things like changing rural votes a little bit makes a difference, it'll make a difference in a place like North Carolina where perhaps there won't be a supermajority.
I hope so.
Even though they may have a majority. That makes a huge difference.
All right.
And that's often the case of one single district. That's the difference.
Yeah. Well, they should go on offense right into the ocean, I think. Yeah, but okay. Right.
Meanwhile, Jack Smith isn't taking the holiday off.
How could he?
There's a piece out in the Wall Street Journal. Jack Smith probe of 2020 election challenges focuses on the lawyers. What? Prosecutors examine efforts to create fake electors and claims made in fundraising drives. So you specifically have subpoenas for Rudy Giuliani, but also Sidney Powell, Emily Newman, a lawyer who worked with Powell, Mike Roman, a Republican operative who headed Election Day operations for the Trump campaign and dispatched lawyers to swing states, as well as Rudy Giuliani. Powell and her defense lawyer didn't return requests for comment. Giuliani and a spokesman for Smith didn't return calls seeking comment. Smith's investigation into efforts to overturn the 2020 elections unfolding as his office prosecutes Trump on separate charges that he retained classified documents. So this is just a reminder that the a false electors thing is a completely different theme, which may or may not be tied into January 6th itself. January 6th may be an incitement thing. False electors may actually be the thing that Jack Smith goes after to charge.
All right, I'm good with that. Although, if they're separate, then
well, remember the other day we talked about the idea that it becomes harder to prosecute Trump if the standard for proving intent is raised by any recent Supreme Court cases. And that may, in fact, have happened.
Oh. Well, all right. I guess we can sit. Well, it's good to know that they're actually taking it seriously, the fake electors thing, as it was a huge outrage, and it wasn't entirely clear that they would be able to construct a theory that wasn't, a frontal assault on what they had done, and I felt like they were worried about doing that.
I'm not defending everything Merrick Garland does.
Oh, all right.
I think he was, slow off the mark on this. But
yes,
remember complaints that, we're ignoring all of the stuff that happened at Bedminster. Apparently, Jack Smith is not.
No, it turns out.
Whether or not he tries somebody or not, he's collecting information and sees whether or not he has a case. What about the false electors? They're ignoring that. Well, as it turns out, Jack Smith is not.
Well, good.
He's collecting information, and we'll see what
he has to work on
charge on the case. Same thing about January 6th, which we knew he wasn't ignoring, and the documents case, which we knew he wasn't ignoring in Florida.
Maybe we just figured he would ignore it because we thought he would take July 4th off so he wouldn't have time.
So I'm just saying there's a whole lot going on, and generally speaking, the way it works is you don't really find out anything until it breaks. And so I'm just, I don't understand why people just automatically assume that he's ignoring, he's slowing down, he's slow walking, he's this, he's that. The proof is there that none of that stuff is true. Stop it already.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can think of is a lot of people who came up, grew up politically when the DOJ was highly politicized under Republican presidents, and they loved to threaten and cajole and leak things and do stuff that didn't have any basis in law, might have, like a good Russian disinformation campaign, it taught them not to trust anybody. And as it turns out, sometimes when other people control the Department of Justice, they operate under the normal rules and standard protocols. And I know you learned that those don't matter when Republicans have the keys to the DOJ. But remember, this is the other part.
I grew up with John Mitchell being there because Nixon put him there.
Yes.
And the guy was a crook.
Yeah. All right. But yeah, I think we kind of got the style of politicization was a little bit different, and the love of leaks among in the Republican DOJ, I guess, taught people to think, well, DOJ leaks like a sieve. They're really not supposed to, and when they actually operate according to their rules, you don't hear much until they're ready for you to hear it. And I guess maybe that still comes as a surprise to people. You know, in the particularly now in the 24-hour news cycle era, when, I guess people think that because they cover the news 24 hours a day, there should be new stuff in each of those 24 hours. And then when there isn't, they get impatient. I don't know.
Right. And by the way, when I say Mitchell was a crook, I'm not just being hyperbolic. He was sentenced to 2.5 to 8 years in prison for his role in the Watergate break-in, and he was disbarred in New York.
Yeah, well,
he was a crook. And so I grew up thinking the Department of Justice was going to be compromised. But, these days, at least under Democrats, the only people who leak are the New York FBI office.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah.
And they generally leak to Rudy.
It's like, I don't know what it is. It's just our attention spans have gotten shorter, instant gratification, 24-hour news thing. I think that just exacerbates all of the natural impatience with, if the guy is a crook, come on already. Yeah, I understand that sentiment. Right. Sure.
So that's basically what's going on in the world. The Saudis and the Russians are trying to keep oil prices up to help both of them, which is, of course, going to hurt us. They really don't care about us.
Well, no.
There's information that not only are the Gulf people being suborned and
white people?
and basically corrupted by Saudi money.
Oh, yes.
Tennis people are too.
Apparently
there's some proposals to change how tennis works with Saudi money.
Yes,
and
I think
John
everything.
McEnroe said it's ridiculous. Everybody look and see what's going on with golf. It's absurd that we're even discussing this.
Yes.
Of course, McEnroe uses absurd a lot, but in this particular case, he's right.
Yeah, he is. I mean, this is clearly part of a concerted effort, because there's also something going on. What I just saw that the Saudi, I think they're probably again the Sovereign Wealth Investment Fund, is buying out a sports ownership group here in the Washington D.C. area that owned, let's see, the basketball teams, men's and women's, the Wizards and the Mystics, and also the hockey team, the Caps, the Capitals, and I don't know what else they own. Maybe a soccer team thrown in there for good luck.
Yeah, throw in a senator.
Yeah, right.
And a future draft choice.
They should probably do that. But then again, and it's an active program, and I've seen people who follow these developments call it. They may come up with a better name for it later on, but sports washing, essentially. Like whitewashing, greenwashing, other washing terms that we've now come to understand. The idea being we'll insinuate ourselves into popular culture in a way that'll make us seem like, people love sports. We support sports, not chopping people up.
It's even more than that. It's bigger than that in the sense that, as you may have heard, CNN is going through a few things.
Yes.
And one of the things that happened is Jeff Zucker was fired, and they brought other people in to do it, and that didn't work. It actually was even worse. So Chris Licht was fired, and now they're trying to figure out what to do. You heard that whole story.
I am free in the afternoons.
But Jeff Zucker had a fantasy.
Oh.
He would get together a bunch of investors, and he would buy CNN.
Oh, what an idea.
From the people who were ruining it.
Oh.
The Elon Musk types who have enough money to buy it in the first place, the Warner Discovery people, but have figured out maybe under us it's not an asset. Maybe it's becoming a liability because we don't know how to run the place. Maybe we'll look for a buyer. I mean, there's certainly a lot of that talk out.
Okay.
So Zucker had this fantasy that he could find some investors and maybe buy it himself.
Mm-hmm.
And who was he been talking to?
Well, who has that kind of money?
Well, the Saudis and their investment fund.
Sure, and they'd like nothing more. I mean,
so it's one thing to own a sports network, and it's another thing to own a network.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't been thinking about that, but I assume anything that can be bought is cool. I'm sure they're.
So what kind of influence do the Saudis have there? Maybe you won't call him Mr. Bonesaw anymore.
I mean, well, I don't know.
On CNN,
Oh,
so
no,
whether or not,
but I'm not on CNN.
That's going to be permitted by the feds. That's another story altogether. But I'm just saying there's a lot of rumors out there, and the acquisition and the detrimental nature of what the Saudis are up to these days goes even beyond 54 golf.
Yes. Well,
which we call live, but actually are the Roman numerals.
No, you're right about that. We found that out. I read one article that said it was true, so that's it.
Yeah,
I assume that
true.
it is
I read
true.
it on the internet.
Yeah, but this can't come as a surprise to anybody, really, if they think about it. Although, if it does, or if it slowly turns on the light bulb and say, oh, yeah, that just shows kind of how successful the program can be. Like soccer fans, but the kinds of soccer fans who would call themselves football fans rather than soccer fans, because they follow, the English Premier Leagues and the European teams. I mean, I guess sometimes it's so pervasive that they might not even know what they're looking at, but like the sponsors of everything there is, like, why does every soccer jersey that the kids worldwide are wearing as they emulate their favorite soccer stars say Fly Emirates and Qatar Airways and everything else what are those things? They're so pervasive that the kids who wear the shirts don't have any idea. It's just what my favorite player wears. Yeah, it's Middle Eastern oil money insinuating its way into Western popular culture, because Western popular culture runs on money, and they have that money, and we gave it to them in exchange for the oil. So, it can't really come as a surprise, but the fact that they're also moving it into sports where the players don't generally wear sponsor labels, I guess, is supposed to be shocking somehow. And too bad. And so you don't wear the labels. We'll put it on the signage in the background. Or screw it. We'll just buy the whole place. And we'll sell advertising to other people.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's what I got. I'm out of material.
Okay. That's a good time to run out.
Tomorrow's a holiday, and I don't know if you'll be on, but I'll be on Wednesday.
Okay, yes,
and
that's right.
I won't be on tomorrow.
Right, it doesn't matter whether it's a holiday or not. For you, for me, all right, I got to find out what Joan is up to. It's a holiday for her. I don't know whether she's going to want to, or maybe the fireworks will already have started early in the morning there. People lighting them all weekend. They got to jump on these things. All right. So, by Wednesday, we'll be independent from Britain.
Idaho, Iowa, one of those high states?
No. Yeah, she's moved further west. I think it's Portland is where she's landed. I can't remember whether it was Portland or Seattle now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But what's the difference to people here on the East Coast, to which it's like, I don't know, it's past like Pittsburgh, I think. Shoo. I don't know where that place is. But now that I say it out loud, I'm not certain which one it was.
One's closer to Canada than the other one is.
Yes, that's true. And I think now she lived in Seattle for a while, in between, when Idaho to Seattle, then back to Idaho. I don't think it was Seattle that she went back to, but now I'm wondering, I'm questioning myself, and I don't hear her report she doesn't talk about the local news quite as much as she used to when she was in Idaho, but maybe I can press her to do that, just so we know where she is. Okay. Well, we'll see you on Wednesday. We'll be independent from Britain by that point, I understand.
So they say.
Yeah. And that's always good news. And also the Battle of Gettysburg is over. So.
Yeah, interesting thing about that.
Oh.
There used to be forts named after Confederate generals.
Right, the guys who lost.
And there's still forts named after Union generals. So just a reminder, since you brought up Gettysburg, George Gordon Meade, says Wikipedia, was a U.S. Army Major General who commanded the Army of the Potomac during the American Civil War. And He won the Battle of Gettysburg.
Well, yeah. And
That's
there's
like
a
a
Fort
big
Meade
deal.
right now.
John Bell Hood, Fort Hood,
Yes, there's another one
was
of
a
those.
Confederate general during the American Civil War. Hood's impetuosity led to high losses among his troops as he moved up in rank. Bruce Catton, Stillness at Appomattox, a historian, wrote that the decision to replace Johnston with Hood was probably the single largest mistake that either government made during the war. So naturally, you'd name a fort after him.
Yeah, right. I think that may
And
have
argue
been,
about, well,
you should have
we
stayed
shouldn't
in the
change
fort.
it because, like, why?
Heritage, not hate. Yeah, he was
Loser.
the loser, the worst general fighting on the side of sex trafficking. So, why not name a fort? And maybe the idea was if we name the fort after him, next time he'll stay in the fort and not come out here and ruin things for the rest of us.
Right.
But he was already long dead.
The Union, of course, had Grant, and the Union had Sherman. The Union also had Meade. Wasn't bad.
Yeah.
Not all of the Union generals so great. I mean, fighting Joe Jackson was pretty bad, but none of them were as bad as Hood. And there were some brilliant strategists on the Confederate side. But Meade was a pretty good general. There's a fort named after him.
All right.
And you know what? Gettysburg was like important.
Yeah, as it turns out. And people
so as you said at the beginning of the show, I'll end my segment the way you began. If you just remember one thing, one battle of the Civil War, Gettysburg is it.
Probably true. I mean,
and well worth learning about.
Yeah, and you can actually go there and run around and tour the field, and that's a big pilgrimage, and they do a big reenactment too, which is kind of weird and a little bit
you can
creepy.
get up on Big Cops and Little Cops and see what it's like looking down and look and see where Pickett's charge was and why it failed.
Yeah, and why you wouldn't do it if you were them, I'm sure. But all right. Yeah, lots to, I wonder about that. I should do a survey about the one, if there's only one battle from the Civil War that you know about. I wonder whether people who live locally near other, like in Manassas, would they be like, Battle of Manassas? Or,
or Vicksburg, for example. I think Vicksburg had a different view of what was important.
Yeah, that's probably true. Locally, local interest. All Civil Wars are local, Greg. As it turns out, just like politics, because it's just politics by other means. Yep. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday.
I served on the
independently. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And boy, oh boy, there's a lot to catch up on here. And like I said, a lot of it is about the 303 Creative Court case, and I put aside a lot of articles about it. Obviously, we want to talk about it and probably talk about it just a little bit more. But I also, there were so many that I also had to stop stocking Pocket with stories about it. But so now the decision about whether to stick with that because it's timely or get to a bunch of other things. But now I'm also looking ahead to the schedule. Next week is also a wacky week. Like this week could be wacky. What if we decide not to do a July 4th show because we were up all night listening to fireworks and we're too tired? Or Joan is like, oh, by no means. I have to start barbecuing at 7 a.m. I don't really know what the plans are. Or no, I'm closed for business. It's July 4th. Get out of here. Do we go ahead and do a show? Are people at home and want to hear something familiar just to keep them company? Or do I want to, do something else? I really don't know. And we do these things in the spur of the moment here. So, but in addition to that, let's see. Also, next week, I've got one day in the middle of the week. I'm already forgetting which day it is. I got to be out of town, on the road, more college-bound kid work to take care of, orientation. So that will take me away from the mic one day, at least for live shows. And then the vacation is coming up, and I have to kind of prepare for that. And some of these things, there's a lot of material. Actually, no, pretty much no matter what I do, there's enough material, archival material that we can mine, not only for reruns, but also just things that have been in Pocket forever. If I can find the time to read them, at last. That might make an interesting show. By the way, we already had the birthday mention for Mighty OCD. I didn't get a chance to call out his suggestion and see what you guys think of this. Or maybe you don't even remember this stuff, but we were thinking of, well, what are we going to use for rerun material when vacation comes around, if that's how we're going to handle it. And he was saying you should do old reruns, like really old reruns would be from the call-in era of Kagro in the Morning. How many people even remember that? It was very early on, and it wasn't the very beginning of the show necessarily, but we were offered some real interesting software that would permit us to take VoIP phone calls. Although, anyway, the point was that we could keep people on the line and answer phone calls and integrate it in through our stream, our live stream, doing it all by computers versus, the old school, radio with a switchboard. That's fine. Everybody can figure out the engineering of that, but making it happen on a live stream was kind of extraordinary. And we ended up, well, for one thing, the software shriveled up and died and never really caught on, and there wasn't big money behind it to keep it operating. And two, it also became quickly apparent that we would do better if we had the opportunity to screen callers and speak to them a little bit beforehand and figure out what was going to be the topic of discussion, although I'm sure they love the freewheeling nature of it. But that's an idea. Maybe we can bring back a rerun from that. It's going to be interesting. I have to dig around just in the tags to see if I can find, how can I identify ones that had calls? I'll have to look at the summary of all of these old shows. So we'll see if we can't dig up one or another of them and play that. It'll be interesting probably just to hear how the show has changed generally since then. An interesting suggestion. So we'll perhaps give that a try as a belated birthday gift to Mighty OCD. Okay. And, okay. Let's see if we can reset the voice here. Let's get into some of these pieces that I put aside on the various SCOTUS cases. But let me see, which I put a bunch of things aside. I kind of have to scroll back down and see where do things switch over to these stories about 303 Creative. Probably about here, although, this might be in the first of the ones that I put aside, which was Don Moynihan's Substack article. And then as things progressed through the weekend, we started to see mainstream news outlets also covering the story, which I put aside just in terms of it's one thing to have Substackers grousing about this stuff, but let's also at least acknowledge that this is widely enough recognized that it's now appearing in the mainstream press. But then it developed even further. Now then the opinion writers were catching wind of it and adding third layers of reaction that was interesting to this. Okay, so Don Moynihan, we better get to the readings or we're not going to make it. The Era of Judicial Pretzeling is his title here on his Substack. Let's see. What does student loan debt forgiveness and a Colorado law banning discrimination have in common? That would be the law in question in 303 Creative. The obvious answer is, what's the similarities between those two cases? That the Supreme Court blocked both efforts on the same day. Yes, the facially easy answer. What's more striking is the degree of judicial pretzeling the court needed to do to arrive at the desired decisions. Of course, Greg reminded you of what Armando has told us for years, and really maybe what I ought to be doing is seeing if I can persuade Armando to make another couple appearances on the show. Except we, I guess we kind of know where it's going, but that's the reason we want to have him. I mean, we know what he's going to say about these things. We want to have him say it, though. So we'll see what kind of schedule he's got. But anyway, so what's more striking, the degree of judicial pretzeling the court needed to do to arrive at the desired decisions. In both cases, the conservative majority decided that imagined harms were more important than actual harms. Both cases, to a striking degree, relied on legal fictions, even as the decision will have very real consequences. If you have not been paying close attention to the cases, maybe this was unclear. But look at the details and it becomes striking how much the conservative majorities had to engage in make-believe to get the results they wanted. Let's look at each in turn. I guess first up here, but we got to get the pop-up out of the way. Student loan forgiveness. Are we the bad guys? For some reason it asks. People can reasonably disagree about the virtue of the student loan forgiveness policy. Here is a good version of the case against it and in support of the SCOTUS decision from Ilya Somin, and is linked herein. So he's presenting both sides here. I, Don says, was more interested in this topic because I was a fan of how well the Biden administration had designed the service delivery, which was a model of using technology to reduce administrative burdens. The legal strategy of the Biden administration rested on the premise that since no one would be harmed by the policy, no one could establish standing to sue to block its implementation. This seemed like a pretty good bet for a while, but as soon as SCOTUS took the case, it was clear that the conservative majority would stretch dubious claims of standing to arrive at the desired outcome. The nonprofit student loan servicing company at the center of the case, the Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority, which is acronymed here as MO, Missouri, HELA, Higher Education Loan Authority. And I don't know whether they say Mohila or what, but that's how it's spelled out. Stated publicly, this is the student loan servicing company at the center of the case, stated publicly that they did not want to be involved. Emails from confused employees asked, are we the bad guys? But the Supreme Court declared that the state of Missouri had standing because Mohila was created by the state, even though it is a separate legal entity. And there's a lot of writing about this that gets into the weeds about this. Might be worth investigating and sharing with you. But I mean, I guess the long story short version of it is Missouri went out of its way to create an agency that would be, if not entirely independent. It was clearly supposed to be a self-standing and relatively self-regulating entity that all it did was process student loans and take care of that. And like with, Fannie Mae, Sallie Mae, or the Federal Reserve, it was like one of those independent agencies that was set up to have, if not autonomy from the state, it was set up when it was, when the advantage was to hold it out as separate because it was handling money this way and student loans being processed like this. And though they weren't the lender, it also wasn't the state. In other words, when it advantaged the powers that be in Missouri to think of it as independent and separate from the state, they promoted that view of it. When it became necessary to say, well, it's a state agency, it really isn't, and so therefore the state of Missouri can sue on its behalf, then they dismissed the independence and pretended it didn't exist. And the court was willing to accept this and to say, Mohila does not have standing to sue, but the state of Missouri has standing to sue because it created Mohila. And the theory was, well, if people aren't paying their student loans, then Mohila won't get the revenue from that. But I mean, that's kind of always been true. And it doesn't really matter very much. And if the debt is satisfied, then who cares? And if there's no legal basis on which to collect these debts, then there's really no, it's highly questionable what the harm actually is to Mohila. If there's not a debt to collect, legally speaking, then there are no fees to collect on the collection of the debt, that there's no debt, there's no reason to be collecting, no legal basis for collecting. But Okay, would they lose revenue? They might. Does the state lose revenue? Well, they're not the state, and then it's highly questionable even if you pretend they are the state. It's complex at a certain level, but the point here really is that if anybody's harmed by this, it's Mohila, and Mohila has no interest in suing. And so the question is, how is it that the plaintiff in this key Supreme Court case finds itself like puzzled as, what am I even doing here? I didn't mean to bring this case. I didn't bring this case. Somebody else brought this case and said it was for me. Should that be allowed? Probably not. But here it is. So, where do we leave off here? Justice Kagan's dissent laid bare their degree of hypocrisy, the degree, I guess, of hypocrisy involved in the case. Is there a person in America who thinks Missouri is here because it is worried about Mohila's loss of loan servicing fees? I think she goes on to say, if so, I'd like to meet him. But I don't even know. Maybe that was a lie. She didn't actually want to meet him. So it was left out of this recounting here. But the court pretended to believe Missouri's feigned concern for an entity that did not itself claim any injury. And how bad was the injury, which didn't exist, to Mohila? Not that bad, as it turns out. An analysis by Eleni Shermer and Louise Seamster, if I have the names correct, suggested that the central claims about the scale of the harms was erroneous. The scale of the harms. Plaintiffs claimed that Mohila would have lost 40% of revenue from servicing loans. Shermer and Seamster found that, in fact, the company was set to have a banner year in terms of fees, collecting almost $100 million, an increase on its previous year. Despite a poor record, the company continued to win contracts from the government that SCOTUS declared was harming them. And Shermer and Seamster explained, should the justices affirm this claim, they would effectively be confirming a fake plaintiff, false facts, and an unjust claim. And that is exactly what SCOTUS did. The court's invocation of the major questions doctrine, remember that too, was an invention of recent vintage. But their invocation of major questions doctrine in the case adds insult to injury, since it smacks of ex post facto rationalization, where the court and the court alone can tell the rest of the world what a major question is, handing itself a grand new power to wade into a policy domain when it chooses to. As my Georgetown colleague Josh Chaffetz recently wrote about the major questions doctrine, to use an analogy, if a majority of justices determine that eating an ice cream cone is a major question, then it is not enough that Congress has empowered the agency to eat any dessert it chooses, that being the language that they would have used in their authorizing legislation. It must instead legislate that the agency, quote, can eat any dessert it chooses, including ice cream cones, unquote. But Congress has no way of knowing whether eating an ice cream cone is major until it sees what a majority of justices have to say about it. Moreover, as the legal scholar Bo Bauman has noted, Justice Neil Gorsuch and his colleagues have justified the doctrine on the grounds that Congress is too eager to delegate to agencies in order to avoid political responsibility. So the courts must keep Congress in line. In other words, the justices are paternalistically claiming to protect Congress from itself. Now, in some of the other writings about the student loan case, I've seen Republicans claiming, well, the problem here is that you can't just do this on your own from the presidency. You can't just by executive order, say, get rid of, waive student loan payments. But, and I mean, that's a interesting and perhaps actually even true statement by itself. It just doesn't describe what happened in the case here. There was congressional authorization. There was legislation passed that authorized the president to take action in an emergency situation such as the one contemplated by the COVID pandemic, to take such action. It was explicitly authorized, and then he took that action. And then they said that he could take emergency actions. They didn't say that he could take this emergency action. That's the ice cream cone metaphor here. And, it's like you guys keep saying there has to be congressional authorization in order for there to be executive action and something like this. So then they went and got congressional authorization. And then you're like, well, it didn't authorize specifically this thing. It didn't say John Smith gets to not pay his bills. No, it didn't. But we wrote it in sort of broadly applicable language. Yeah, well, not specific enough. Now, the 303 creative case is treated separately here. The real harms of a fictional wedding web designer. The second decision is amazingly built on even flimsier grounds. And while I'm recounting all of these things, don't forget that this is not new either. Prior to this, the Supreme Court, I remind you, had decided that case. What is that case? I can't remember the name of the case, but the one where the football coach is fired for forcing his players to pray prior to games, and in upholding his lawsuit against the school system that fired him, and I guess offering to reinstate him, the Supreme Court's conservative majority, and I think Alito in particular, were writing that, this was all wrong because he was in fact praying on his own time. He wasn't, mixing his responsibilities as a coach with his personal interest in religion. He was praying on his own time with players who wanted to participate in the prayers along with him, and he wasn't forcing anybody else. And everybody was astonished because, but remember that the facts of the case are, this praying on his own time and privately thing was moments before the beginning of each game. He was bringing his team out to the 50-yard line of the field and praying with them, and in the most prominent possible place, the most prominent possible time for a football coach, and of course, at a time when the entire team had been assembled, and it was extremely important for the game, for the team to remain, unified and in the same mind frame and stick together as teammates, and it had probably been made clear to them that you will be noticed if you don't join us, and if you're not worried about the eyes of the team noticing that you don't join us in the 50-yard line, how about a stadium full of people as well? The whole town will show up, and they'll see exactly which one of you, identified by name and number on the back of your jersey, don't come and pray with us. But that was Alito's idea of doing it on his own time and in private, which was completely ridiculous, but was an escalation from, I believe I'm going to rule this way in Affordable Care Act cases because of the broccoli mandate, which doesn't exist, because of the Cornhusker kickback, which doesn't exist. I mean, they've been making up their own facts on an escalating scale for some time now. So now on to the 303 creative case, right, which Don Moynihan says the second decision is amazingly built on even flimsier grounds, if that's even possible. Here, the court struck down a Colorado law that sought to prevent discrimination of LGBTQ people, ruling that a wedding web designer could not be forced to serve gay couples because of her religious beliefs. This somehow was a free speech issue, even though the case centered on conduct, that is, the refusal to serve, not speech. Publicly stating that you want to discriminate against certain groups, as the plaintiff wished to do in her advertising for her services, that is speech. But it is the discrimination itself that Colorado sought to make illegal, and which SCOTUS struck down as a First Amendment violation. But set that aside, the plaintiff, Lori Smith, Lorie, it was playing a wedding web designer for the purposes of the case. She is a web designer, and she claimed she was restricted in her ability to market her services for weddings because of her inability to discriminate according to her Christian conscience. But prior to filing the case, she had never designed a wedding website. She suffered no legal penalty. The state of Colorado never sought her out or punished her. And it seems no gay couple ever sought to hire her somehow, because no one sought to hire her for weddings at all, because she wasn't really in that business. In court filings, Smith included the name and address of the gay man who she said had reached out to her to secure her services. But when a reporter contacted that man, he indicated that A, he is not gay, but a married straight man with no gay wedding plans, B, had never contacted Smith, and C, was a web designer himself who had little need for the services that he purportedly sought. The first time the man in question had heard of the case, he said, was when the reporter contacted him. Why did the reporter contact him? Because it had made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Amazingly, the guy apparently at the center of the action in this case that had gone all the way to the United States Supreme Court, winding its way through the courts for probably a couple of years, if not more, had never heard of the case because he had nothing to do with the facts of the case. He's not involved. He said, I wouldn't want anybody to make me a wedding website, he continued, sounding a bit puzzled but good-natured about the whole thing when the reporter contacted him. I'm married. I have a child. I'm not really sure where that came from, but somebody's using false information in a Supreme Court filing document. But every level of the court, from district court on up, would have had the same false information. In another interview, he said, it is concerning that nobody connected with this case over the last 6 years has ever thought to call me, email me, text me to try and corroborate that communication in any way. I don't necessarily think that would be a tipping point in this case at all, but at the very least, a case of this magnitude should be corroborated, should be fact-checked along the way. And that's kind of why I think of it as the George Santos of Supreme Court plaintiffs, this 303 creative. It was all out there. Somebody probably did know that they weren't a real entity and that this wasn't a real case, and they just didn't, I don't know, the story just didn't break into the mainstream for whatever reason until it was, again, too late. Moynihan continues here, call me a stickler for facts here, but if I was going to knock down an anti-discrimination law, I would like it to be based on a real conflict and not something that the plaintiff appeared to make up. I would like to know if the plaintiff had simply found details about a random guy who happened to live in San Francisco and used him to represent the risks she would face of being contacted by actual gay men. Very interesting. And it says here, this is bolded and italicized. This must be important. Narratives center on people. By not including actual gay people, the plaintiff and SCOTUS majority colluded to center the narrative around her imaginary travails, which in turn centered the case around their preferred issue of free speech, which people largely support, rather than the discrimination, which generally people oppose. Gay Americans were used as silent legal props solely to erase their rights. Now I see why it's bolded and italicized. Now, here, next section, what judicial self-aggrandizement looks like. Oh, I see pictures of praying football players coming up, so I guess I should have just let him make that connection instead. In one case, SCOTUS accuses the executive branch of overreach when it itself has bent over backwards to find a way to get around the basic legal issue of standing. In the other case, it seems unperturbed that the Christian conscience it gives license to discriminate was also a conscience that apparently built a legal case around a lie. The two cases stand out for their misrepresentations, but they're not the only ones. Last year, the court held that a football coach could engage in, quote, short, private, personal prayer at work, when the prayer in question was very public, taking place in front of fans and students in the middle of the football field at games in which at least some students felt compelled to participate. Again, there's an obvious gap between the plain facts of the case and what the conservative majority purported to have happened. And again, a Christian majority court accepts the claims of religiously based rights of their fellow Christians. Freedom from religious discrimination is transformed into freedom to engage in discrimination. Legal scholar Josh Chaffetz argues that judicial self-aggrandizement has been a tendency of the Roberts Court, one which has simply become more apparent with the conservative supermajority. This untethering of factual reasoning from judgments is also an area where the SCOTUS decisions mirrored a haughty indifference to accountability for their private actions. It's the sort of bizarro reasoning that leads Alito's risible claim that the value of flight on a private or risible, isn't that the right pronunciation? Of the value of a flight on a private plane given to him by a conservative billionaire was zero because the seat would otherwise have gone unused. Seems convenient. Or that the Thomas family had no need to even report on the flow of money they received from conservative activists because Ginny Thomas does not speak with her husband about court decisions. Sure thing. Yeah, not particularly believable either. Employing such fictions to defend the receipt of gifts and cash that no other federal employees could receive makes SCOTUS judges look out of touch with reality. Employing them to decide court decisions has real consequences. Tens of millions of people will no longer benefit from student loan forgiveness, and LGBTQ couples must accept that they live in a world where businesses can proudly tell them that they are not welcome. As the YOLO court continues to push the boundaries of legal reasoning to get what it wants, its legitimacy will stumble further. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I'm going to continue rolling on with commentary on these two cases and their fake fact patterns. I mean, it's that astonishing. So I don't know. I kind of want to collect opinion from the usual suspects. In that sense, I guess we won't cast the net that much wider, but they're good suspects, and that's the reason we keep going back to them. First stop on this train will be Jamel Bowie, writing, of course, in the New York Times under the headline of Elena Kagan has had enough. And she, just like Ketanji Brown Jackson, used the opportunity to let the right wing of the court know exactly what she thought was going on. You have probably already heard about the Supreme Court's decision in Biden v. Nebraska. Jamel begins. That's the actual name of the case we're talking about with the, the student debt relief, program. But interestingly, it is Biden versus Nebraska. But remember that the whole thing hinges on what they allege was happening where? Not Nebraska, but Missouri. So there's a lot of weirdness going on already. It's becoming a more complicated case. But there's a genuine explanation for how it is that we end up focusing on Missouri, despite the fact that the case is styled Nebraska. They sometimes will combine cases. That's not a big deal, but okay. You probably already heard about the Supreme Court's decision. A 6-3 majority of the court, split along partisan lines, struck down President Biden's student debt relief plan. After blowing past an obvious problem of standing, the plaintiff, the state of Missouri, not Nebraska, could not establish any injury to itself and had to sue on behalf of a state-created debt servicing company. Chief Justice John Roberts rejected the administration's argument that the HEROES Act, that's the act of Congress we were discussing before, allowed the president to pursue large-scale debt relief. It did. But He just decided it didn't. Roberts did not base his conclusion on the text of the law. Instead, he used the major questions doctrine, which says that the court can overrule executive agencies if it believes their actions implicate questions of major political and economic significance that, in its view, require clear congressional direction. For this court, Biden's student debt relief program was simply too large and too consequential to be allowed to stand. Parenthetically, he adds here, I'd be remiss if I did not point out that the main effect of this doctrine, meant to restore lawmaking authority to Congress, is to hand immense discretionary power to unelected judges. And, of course, the outcome of it, well, we have to restore lawmaking authority to Congress. Well, they made this law. Yeah, well, it affects things that are really big. And so something, I mean, they just turned it inside out on itself and said, well, even when Congress authorizes it, it doesn't authorize it. Why? I don't know, because. Bye. Anyway, but I don't want to discuss Roberts' majority opinion as much as I want to do Justice Elena Kagan's dissent. Kagan wrote something unusual. She didn't just challenge the Chief Justice's reasoning, she questioned whether the court's decision was even constitutional. From the first page to the last, today's opinion departs from the demands of judicial restraint, Kagan wrote. At the behest of a party that has suffered no injury, the majority decides a contested public policy issue properly belonging to the politically accountable branches and the people they represent. She continued, that is a major problem not just for governance, but for democracy, too. Congress is, of course, a democratic institution. Maybe. It responds, even if imperfectly, to the preferences of American voters, and agency officials, though themselves not elected, serve a president with the broadest of all political constituencies. But this court, it is, by design, as detached as possible from the body politic. That is why the court is supposed to stick to its business, to decide only cases and controversies. That comes directly from the Constitution. You can look it up. Show me in the Constitution where it says that. It's all over it. It's Article 3. To decide only cases and controversies, and to stay away from making this nation's policy about subjects like student loan relief. Remember when the conservative mantra used to be, you can't let judges, activist judges, legislate from the bench. That's this all over. The court, Kagan continued, exercises authority it does not have. It violates the Constitution. It's a remarkable statement. To say that the Supreme Court can violate the Constitution is to reject the idea that the court is somehow outside the constitutional system. It is to remind the public that the court is as bound by the Constitution as the other branches, which is to say that it is subject to the same checks and balances as the legislature and the executive. Kagan's dissent, in other words, is a call for accountability. For Congress, especially, to exercise its authority to discipline the court when it oversteps its bounds. Democrats may or may not get this particular message, but John Roberts heard it loud and clear. It has become a disturbing feature of some recent opinions to criticize the decisions with which they disagree as going beyond the proper role of the judiciary, he wrote in his opinion. It is important that the public not be misled either. Any such misperception would be harmful to this institution and our country. For Roberts, the problem isn't that the Supreme Court is overstepping its bounds. It is that one of its justices has decided that she's had enough. So, that was pretty interesting. And it is an interesting interpretation of things that Kagan is calling for Congress to step in and, well, curtail the Supreme Court's freewheeling tendencies, or and maybe that's by expanding the court or limiting its jurisdiction. But yeah, that's a fair reading of, I think, what she had to say. If you get to the point where the Supreme Court is routinely ruling in, if not unconstitutional, and certainly extra constitutional style, and simply usurping the role of the other branches, well, the check and balance in that is written right into the Constitution. You know exactly what you can do. You can change, you can limit the jurisdiction of the court and you can expand the court. The danger of letting this lie is, of course, that if they can do this, then the court can say, well, it's really beyond the power of the Congress to expand the court. It's happened before, but we find the legislation expanding the court unconstitutional, and we strike it down. On partisan lines, of course. Would you let that stand? And that's one of those areas where you're once again back in the constitutional gray zone of immovable objects and irresistible forces. We've mentioned how you get there in the past before. All right, let's see. Other items on the same topic. I still have to continue on the same topic. I guess I can skip the Associated, well, can I? Why did I park this Associated Press straight news piece on it? I guess it was basically, just to establish the fact that the mainstream news outlets are actually catching wind of this now, too. The AP's headline on this one, the man named in the Supreme Court's gay rights ruling says he didn't request a wedding website. Now, you know that to be the case from the opinion pieces we read. Mark, did you possibly send this one along? Is that what it is? Just sort of establishing the baseline facts of it. But I think we've got all that. I'll include that in the roundup, though, so that you can all see that it's getting as mainstream gets. But the thing I'll spend the on-air time with you on is yet one more opinion take on it. Amanda Marcotte, of course. Why not sample from what she's putting out there today? She'll have a lot to say about this. And here it is from Salon magazine. Fraud, quote, justice. Anti-LGBTQ decision based on a fake case showcases the Supreme Court's illegitimacy. Far-right lawyers created a phony victim in the made-up case, and the justice with the stolen seat wrote the opinion. That's a good point, too. Gorsuch on the opinion. Somewhere out there, I'm sure, and I may already have missed it, but I'll have to collect it and read it for you to do even more on this case. But someone, I think, has put together a good explainer on how these fake plaintiffs come to find themselves a way to not even be real enough to actually be in business, but real enough to find themselves in front of the Supreme Court. And it will surprise no one that the network, coordinated by, if not entirely run and funded by Leonard Leo, is the one doing it. Hooking people up, prospective fake plaintiffs up with free lawyers from the various ideological legal foundations to do all the representation. And they're made up of, lawyers who were clerks for the justices they'll be arguing in front of. So, but the way this networking works and the number of interlocking groups in these networks that these plaintiffs are handed off to, one to the other, to basically make it cost-free for the person who decides to step up and seize the limelight as the fake plaintiff. Anyway, first we'll stick with what Amanda had to say about these things here. For a brief moment this summer, after the Supreme Court declined to overthrow democracy and invite Donald Trump to steal the 2024 election, there was a surge of hope that the 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents were starting to dial back their radicalism in the face of the massive public backlash. For years, the Supreme Court had enjoyed a measure of undeserved goodwill from the public, mostly because people don't pay close attention and assume the court is still in the business of upholding human rights instead of decimating them. After the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year, however, voters started to wake up to the fact that a well-funded right-wing movement led by the Federalist Society had stacked the court with a bunch of hacks who care little for law or precedent. Added to the pile were well-publicized stories highlighting the corruption of justices like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, who shamelessly enjoy free vacations funded by right-wing billionaires. The result is that only 31% of voters approve of the Supreme Court, according to the NBC News poll, which is down from 44% in January of 2021. And I guess the fact that we're reminding everybody of the free vacations, etc. I mean, you might as well keep in mind that the same people who are setting up fake plaintiffs with free lawyers are also giving the justices who will decide their cases free vacations. So you see where this begins to kind of come together and coalesce into a pretty solid plan for getting what you want, doing wish casting essentially and turning it into reality by buying judges, buying plaintiffs. If you buy enough parties to the case, you can set the stage for inventing the law that you wish was in existence, even though it isn't. And I guess I can summarize that. Maybe at the end of the article, we'll have some time to give you the way I summarize those thoughts over the weekend on social media. Anyway, well, any hope that the court had moderated itself was dashed late last week. I thought we were kind of being set up for something horrific, possibly, but that was like no great prediction or anything. Gee whiz, what do you think a 6-3 conservative supermajority on the court is going to do this term? Probably screw us over. Oh, well, they didn't screw us over right here. Yeah, well, they'll probably screw us over on something else. That's not a genius prediction, but not everybody made it, I guess. Anyway, all hope that the court had moderated itself, which was not a smart hope to have, was dashed late last week with a series of decisions that weren't just awful, but involved the conservative justices thumbing their noses at any law, precedent, or even facts that got between them and their preferred far-right policies. On Thursday, the court overruled 50 years of precedent to decide that affirmative action in college admissions is illegal. And I have a nice explainer that we might be able to get to at some point about that. Embedded here, by the way, the tweet of Janai Nelson, who writes quotes Justice Sotomayor, who had written, "The court's recharacterization of Brown v. Board of Education, is nothing but revisionist history and an affront to the legendary life of Justice Marshall, a great jurist who was the champion of true equal opportunity, not rhetorical flourishes about color blindness." Too bad. On Friday, the court doubled down on its attacks on equal education by ruling against President Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness program. As Justice Elena Kagan wrote in her dissent, the court today exceeds its proper limited role in our nation's governance by simply ignoring a law passed by Congress because conservatives don't like it. But for the case that most exquisitely illustrates the illegitimacy of the current iteration of the Supreme Court, we should turn to 303 Creative, LLC versus Elenis, if I have the pronunciation right. This case is a straight-up fraud from every angle and had no business even being before the Supreme Court. To begin with, it's a redux of a 2018 case, Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado, which addressed a baker who violated Colorado's ban on anti-LGBTQ discrimination by refusing to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. I mean, this is really, it's starting to take on the feel of somebody saying, well, I want to be famous for having a Supreme Court thing. I'll do it. I'm going to start a fake business and say I didn't want to do a gay wedding thing either. And you wonder, like, with limited time on their hands, why the Supreme Court even said, yeah, let's do this one again. Anyway, the case was brought. Here's some more information about the background here. This is helpful. The case was brought by the Alliance Defending Freedom. Sounds good. Freedom. A right-wing group demanding that Christians have the privilege to opt out of anti-discrimination laws. ADF lost its case. That should have been the end of it, but ADF wanted another bite at the apple. Not because any facts or any laws had changed, but because the makeup of the court had, due to Donald Trump getting 2 more nominees, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, onto the bench. So now you got a different court, we want to go again. But what makes this clown show even worse is that the complaint at the heart of 303 Creative is completely made up. In Masterpiece, there really was a baker who really did discriminate against the gay couple, creating both standing and a fact pattern to discuss in court. With 303 Creative, however, the facts justifying this case are all make-believe. The plaintiff, Lori Smith, sued on the grounds that she doesn't want to make wedding websites for same-sex couples, but no one had actually requested that she do so. For one simple reason, she didn't make wedding websites. Her lawsuit was purely hypothetical. Legally, she shouldn't have had the right to sue at all. To get around the fact that their client had no right to sue, ADF claimed she had received an inquiry from a man named Stewart, who had made some vague questions about maybe hiring 303 Creative in the future for a wedding to Mike, it says here in quotes. But it appears that the entire story may be fabricated. Melissa Gira Grant of the New Republic contacted Stewart using the email and phone number included in the lawsuit. He denies having sent that request, pointing out he's already married to a woman. The initial lawsuit did not mention the Stewart inquiry, which was submitted to Smith's website on September 21st, according to the date stamp shown in later court filings, indicating that she received it the day after the suit was originally filed. Grant writes, how interesting is that? What a remarkable coincidence. How fortunate that this alleged request came in right as ADF needed to shore up their dubious claim that their plaintiff had any business in a court at all. I mean, that didn't come up. Nobody says, you filed this suit because you got a request to create a gay wedding website, but you didn't get the request until after you had filed the suit. That's weird. Can you explain that? No questions. So what gives? It's unlikely that ADF was having trouble finding Christian business owners unwilling to discriminate against gay couples in the real world. A-holes are a dime a dozen, after all. But it is worth pointing out that Masterpiece Cake Shop wasn't just a legal loss for ADF, but bad public relations as well. By adopting a real case, they put a human face on the issue, both in terms of the baker, Jack Phillips, and the couple he refused service to, Charlie Craig and David Mullins. The public could see that the real victims here were Craig and Mullins, two perfectly nice guys who got a face full of hate when they were innocently shopping for a wedding cake. Phillips, however, came across as a jerk. With 303 Creative, however, the crime is hypothetical. There are no actual victims to feel sorry for. Granted, any video of Smith erases all doubt that the woman is a smug and despicable Karen, unsurprisingly. And here is some video of that nature embedded here in the piece. Still, without a real gay couple to talk to reporters, it allowed ADF to present an entirely one-sided narrative. That is interesting, isn't it? Bigotry is less upsetting to people when it's abstract. And that was a major thing. It's amazing that the both sides media didn't realize, for what they said 6 years, that there was one of the sides was missing. Well, we got to do a both sides story on this thing. Where's the other side? I don't know. Never mind. Who cares? That side doesn't count. The point is that the side that complains when they're not represented in both sides fashion is here. So we're not going to get complaints. So let's just roll forward. Is that what happened? Is that all that explains it? But it also, she says, should have meant that the court rejected her case out of hand since it's built on a sandcastle of lies. As Vox's legal expert Ian Millhiser wrote, federal courts, including the Supreme Court, do not have jurisdiction to decide hypothetical cases. It's actually taught exactly that way in law school. Hypotheticals don't come before the court. It doesn't happen that way. There has to be a real injury. And by the way, why then does it make sense? Why do justice nominees, federal bench nominees, get away with being asked questions about major policy issues, major judicial issues, and they say, I don't answer hypotheticals. I can't address hypotheticals. I won't address hypotheticals. That flies in part because as a judge, they're really not supposed to answer hypotheticals. Although, I mean, not as opinions, not as written decisions. They certainly pose hypotheticals and answer them and argue about them all the time in the oral arguments. But anyway, it's not supposed to be the main work that they do when handing down decisions. There's supposed to be a real case or controversy. It says so right in the Constitution. Anyway, they don't have jurisdiction to decide hypothetical cases. That they didn't is yet another sign of how much this isn't a Republican court, but a MAGA one. Only too happy to adopt Donald Trump's tactic of using alternative facts to bolster their case when the actual facts won't do it. In her dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor draws attention to this shadiness by pointing out the many real-world examples of what happens when discrimination against LGBTQ people is legal. It's a reminder that this isn't an abstract issue about religious belief, but a serious threat to the well-being of real people. Mark Joseph Stern's tweet is embedded here, carrying a screenshot of Sotomayor's dissent, making this point. if you want to read it, an easy way to do it. It's fitting that the author of this shameful opinion is Justice Neil Gorsuch, Amanda continues, who is only on the court because Republicans literally stole his seat for him. By all rights, that seat should belong to Merrick Garland, who is currently the Attorney General, because he was nominated in 2016 by President Barack Obama, but then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell illegally refused his duty to hold hearings for Garland. Not so sure. Instead, he held the seat open in direct violation of the Constitution until Donald Trump got into office and placed Gorsuch there instead. Some dispute, obviously, about whether it rises to that level, but you know that backstory. This isn't even the first opinion Gorsuch has written based on made-up facts. She cites the football coach one that has now been twice cited. To get to the desired outcome, both Gorsuch flat out lied about, I don't know why both is in there. Gorsuch flat out lied about the situation, claiming the coach merely offered his prayers quietly while his students were otherwise occupied. I mean, that's a direct and blatant, obvious untruth about what actually happened here. That, and this cannot be stated firmly enough, is a lie. As Sotomayor noted in her dissent, the coach actually held showy prayers on the 50-yard line during games, or at least immediately right before them. He made such a spectacle that members of the public rushed to the field to join Kennedy, jumping fences to access the field and knocking over student band members. She even included helpful pictures, which is an unusual thing in a dissent, to illustrate what a lying liar Gorsuch is. Many of the term's Supreme Court decisions are indefensible when it comes to law and precedent. 303 Creative takes it to the next level, however, being a fake case that was decided by a fraudulent judge. The Supreme Court, in its current iteration, is illegitimate. What that means politically is hard to say, though ideally it would open the door to court reform that would restore both sanity to the decisions and credibility to the court. But with Republicans controlling the House of Representatives, any such reform is a pipe dream. The current situation with a court that has no right to do what it is doing is untenable. They've forsaken their legitimacy, and hopefully that means soon Americans will get fed up enough to strip them of their power. Well, one might hope for that. But yeah, that's essentially the long and short of it, I guess. Over the weekend, I spent time discussing it myself. I was reacting to the mastodon toot of Tristan Snell. I think you know what? I'm trying to think of, do I know Tristan Snell's background too? I think he too. Well, let me find him and let you know. But I'll let's see. Oh, we can look at his bio on the Bird site. Lawyer, yes. Fighter for democracy, in case you wanted to know. And prosecuted Trump University while at the New York AG's office. So, yes, quite a prominent background at that. But he had tweeted, if a law student submitted the majority opinion in 303 Creative on an exam, they would get an F. There was no injury in fact, hence plaintiff lacked standing to sue. Yeah, I think if that fact pattern had been offered on a exam in law school, it would have been, as they say, for issue spotting purposes. You should have been debating whether or not that case should be allowed before the court at all. It would be like the most obvious example. It's a giveaway for a good grade on an exam like that you're given a hypothetical where the person hasn't really established the business. They've never made a wedding website ever, and nobody actually contacts them asking for a website. So they make up a contact, and the person who supposedly contacted them says, I never contacted them. What do you do with the case? And the answer is you dismiss it for lack of standing. But I guess if you wanted to, you could construct an argument that says, okay, take the case. And that would be one of the fun things you could do on an exam as a conservative law student. Do they do such things? Yes. I had to react to this one, and you all know the story on this, but maybe not everyone on Mastodon knew, so felt like I had to tell them. But this, what Tristan Snell is talking about here, is what I always refer to, you know it here on the show, as being pre-wrong about conservative legal theories. In their view, we are all about to be wrong about the basic premises of the law, and we just don't know it yet. You know the story with this. We don't realize it, of course, because we are being taught that precedent, logical consistency, and equal application are the foundations of the law. That's what constitutes the law. It's what makes the law, not the raw exercise of power, or gimmitarianism, as we like to call it. This means, so how does this work? It's all as in, well, to use one of Armando's favorite examples in all this, you think that the Second Amendment is about militias, and it doesn't, as it didn't for nearly 200 plus years, doesn't guarantee explicitly the right of individuals to go about armed on a daily basis for personal protection. That's what you think the Second Amendment is about. It's about militias, not personal protection. Well, you're just wrong about that. And then, you laughed at them for a long time, but by 2009, you were just the regular kind of wrong about that, because after 2009, every law student going through law school had to be taught the opposite of what everyone who had come before had been taught, that the Supreme Court had never taken up such a case. They had never explicitly affirmed an individual right to carry firearms in daily life. It really wasn't about that. And even though it was trending that way, it was important to note that the Supreme Court had never actually gone that far and said that. But then, after 2009, because of the case Heller versus DC in 2008, you had to teach not only that the Supreme Court had addressed such a question, but that along the way they had invented the idea that it really was the Second Amendment about personal safety and being able to go about armed in society day to day. You were wrong. The 200 years of lawyers were just trained wrong. They just didn't know it yet. Every law school student had to be trained the opposite way and learn that you had been wrong, even though the year before you had been, quote unquote, right. Now, the prettied up version of this theory has a better name, by the way, and it was sold to conservative law students and the early days Federalist Society as the Constitution in Exile. That's what they liked to call it, rather than just effing around and gimmitarianism and let's just invent our own facts. By the way, I found out in reading and brushing up on my background and all of that the Constitution in Exile theory, that was taught to me, by the way, at George Mason University's School of Law. I remember exactly how it was done, too. Let me tell you something after this.
You've been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Anyway, I remember my own professors referring it to as the Constitution in Exile. And as it turns out, when it got identified and was extremely unpopular, they began denying that they had ever used that term. And no, this isn't what we mean. It means something else completely. Very interesting. Anyway, now I have to hand things over to Justice without even introducing the stories he's got on tap. Stay tuned.